Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeffrey Nuddin. I am the Executive Director of the Asian American Writers Workshop. We are a national literary organization dedicated to publishing and amplifying Asian American literary culture. Since our founding in 1991, we have worked to cultivate a radically inclusive community of Asian and Asian diasporic writers and readers to mobilize for a more just future. We are in the middle of celebrating our 30th anniversary with a season-long campaign that honors our past and looks ahead to our future. For more information about the workshop, all of our amazing work and programmings, please visit AAWW.org, and you can also find us across all social channels. I am so thrilled and honored to be here tonight with our friends from the Strand bookstore as we celebrate two pieces of work that add a critically important perspective to our understanding of the real and devastating effects of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. Susan H. Kamei's When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II, and George Takei's They Called Us Enemy may differ in genre and format, but they both provide a deeply personal context to the inhumane and immoral policies and practices that led to the incarceration of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans right here on US soil. Susan and George will be in conversation tonight with Brandon Shimoda, a Yonsei poet and writer. I'm going to briefly introduce the three of them by reading their bios, and then we'll virtually welcome Brandon to the stage, who will kick us off tonight. So here we go. Susan H. Kamei received her JD from the Georgetown University Law Center. She teaches at the University of Southern California on the legal ramifications of the incarceration of persons of Japanese ancestry during World War II and how they apply to constitutional issues, civil liberties, and national security considerations today. With an acting career spanning 6 decades, George Takei is known around the world for his founding role in the acclaimed television series Star Trek, in which he played Hikaru Sulu, helmsman of the Starship Enterprise. But Takei's story goes where few stories have gone before. From a childhood spent with his family wrongfully imprisoned in Japanese American internment camps during World War II, to becoming one of the country's leading figures in the fight for social justice, LGBTQ rights, and marriage equality, Takei remains a powerful voice on issues ranging from politics to pop culture. Mashable.com named Takei the #1 most influential person on Facebook, with 10.4 million likes and 2.8 million followers on Twitter. Takei has been a passionate advocate for social justice, outspoken supporter of human rights issues, and a community activist. He has served as the spokesperson for the Human Rights Campaign Coming Out Project and was Cultural Affairs Chairman of the Japanese American Citizens League. He is also Chairman Emeritus and a trustee of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. He was appointed to the Japan-US Friendship Commission by former President Clinton, and the government of Japan awarded Takei the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Race with Rosette for his contribution to US-Japanese relations. The decoration was confirmed by His Majesty Emperor Akihito at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Brandon Shimoda is a Yonsei poet and writer. His books include The Grave on the Wall, published by City Lights in 2019, which received the PEN Open Book Award, and Evening Oracle, published by Letter Machine Editions in 2015, which received the William Carlos Williams Award from the Poetry Society of America. His book on the afterlife of Japanese American incarceration received a creative nonfiction grant from the Whiting Foundation and is forthcoming from City Lights. He lives with his family in Colorado, where he is an assistant professor of English at Colorado College. So without further ado, please welcome Brandon to this virtual stage.
Well, thank you so much, Jeffrey. Really wonderful to see you. Thank you, Sabir. And the Strand, of course, Asian American Writers Workshop. And special thanks to Susan and to George. I'm deeply honored to be moderating, but also grateful to simply be present for this conversation between Susan Kamei and George Takei, both of whom have given us, with their books, Susan's When Can We Go Back to America and George's They Called Us Enemy, panoramic yet intimate and ultimately indispensable accounts of the forced removal, mass incarceration, and resettlement of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans during World War II. Both books, I think, should be required reading, not only so that we might increase our individual and collective awareness and understanding of what happened to the Japanese American community before, during, and after World War II, but so that we can increase awareness and understanding of what is happening now, of what is always happening to immigrant and minoritized and marginalized communities throughout the United States. I know that I, for one, as a descendant of incarcerees and so-called enemy aliens, would have benefited from these books and their lucid narratives when I was growing up. It might have saved me decades of ignorance and misunderstanding, which I am still working my way out of today. Before we open up the conversation, I want to acknowledge two things. First, I think it is important to point out that the titles of Susan's and George's books are not only titles, but voices. That is, they are spoken. One as a statement, they called us enemy. The other as a question, when can we go back to America? Spoken by individuals who have found themselves, by the force of white anxiety and rage masquerading as military necessity, abandoned suddenly in the alienating space of no longer knowing who and what and where they are. The power inherent in the title, "They Called Us Enemy," is the confusion and the despair of an individual who discovers that the only country they have ever known has suddenly declared war on them. Imagine more specifically this confusion and this despair in the mind and in the heart of a child. George Takei was five if I'm not mistaken, when he and his family were incarcerated in the Santa Anita Detention Center in Arcadia, California, then in the Rower concentration camp in Arkansas. When can we go back to America, meanwhile, is a question attributed also to a child in camp. In the introduction to her book, Susan writes, "It's said that a small girl was so startled to be in an environment surrounded by all Japanese faces that she assumed her family had taken her to Japan." There's obviously a lot there to unpack, but what I want to suggest is that inherent in this title is an even darker and more claustrophobic truth, that there was in actuality no going back to America. Because what was revealed to the Japanese American community, as was also revealed to Japanese Canadians and Japanese Mexicans and Japanese South Americans, is that incarceration was as inescapable a representation of America as was the place to which the child was desperate to go back. I think of the French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville, who in 1831 visited the US with the intention of studying this country's prison system. The result of that visit was his book, Democracy in America, in which he wrote, quote, "Not only does democracy make each man forget his ancestors, it hides his descendants from him and divides him from his contemporaries. It continually turns him back into himself and threatens at least to enclose him entirely in the solitude of his own heart." The second thing I want to acknowledge is that today is the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. To be honest, I do not know, nor do I ever know what to make of this anniversary or how to feel about it. Historical events in this country have the strange distinction of becoming over time both more clear and more convoluted. This is because historical events in this country become the emotional and political property of hopelessly irreconcilable interests. The United States has, since December 7th, 1941, used Pearl Harbor, the historical event, for a variety of purposes and comportments, including xenophobia, anti-Asian racism, various forms of nationalist propaganda, and as a justification for the never-ending war on terror. Pearl Harbor and its anniversaries are, for me, anti-memorials for both Japanese American incarceration and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Susan's and George's books both begin with the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Imperial Army, December 7th, 1941. It is a compelling and also a complicated place to begin. In observance of the 80th anniversary, I thought that we could start our conversation here. So Susan and George, welcome to the stage. Hi, good to see you.
Hi, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much.
And thank you for your books, of course. In acknowledging today, I thought maybe we could start with Pearl Harbor and thinking about, George, what you remember about that day, as well as the immediate aftermath. And then for both of you, what is it that you think about on December 7th, 2021, on the 80th anniversary? Where is your mind? What are some of the things that you remember or think about?
I was 4 years old then. My birthday was April 20th, my fifth birthday was April 20th, 1942. So I was 4 years old. And what I remember is a lot of excited conversations between my parents and my father making phone calls to many of his friends. But I really don't have a very sharp memory beyond the confusion and excitement of my parents at that time. As a teenager, one of my Japanese American friends used to say, that's the day we celebrate, to some of his other bratty friends and make a joke of it. But certainly for me today, it is a profoundly sobering day. That's when, first of all, the horror of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. More than 2,800 people were killed. 19 ships were sunk, 8 of them battleships. And the terror of that bombing swept across the Pacific to the West Coast and then continued rolling across till the whole country was swept up in this hysteria. And there's that organic racism that existed prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it resulted in Japanese Americans being spat on and assaulted on the street, our government coming down with a curfew, with our bank accounts being frozen, financially straitjacketing our parents. And so there was all that horror that happened to us, but the horror was created by our fellow Americans. So it is a big challenge for us Japanese Americans who experienced that to try to put December 7th in that context for the larger American public. And December 7th exposed the fragility of our democracy. And that's our mission, to try to get this country more aware of the fallibility of the people who have to make our democracy what it purports to be. And that's our mission, and that's why we write books and try to raise the awareness of the issues involved here.
Susan.
I recall my father saying he was a 14-year-old from a farming family in Orange County here in California, Southern California. And he and his siblings and his parents were getting ready to go out and work in the fields when they heard the news. And even as a high school freshman, my father knew that with that news, their lives had forever changed. And he didn't know how bad it was going to be or in what way it would change, but he just knew that their status and what was going to become of them was never going to be the same. And I think the what George mentioned about the pre-war racial discrimination and prejudicial environment is something that to remember now, and for us to appreciate that the government narrative wanted to have us think that in history, looking back on history, that we were attacked by this enemy, and so this was the cause for thinking of persons of Japanese ancestry as the enemy. But in reality, that was a powder keg that was already loaded, and so it is complex to think about Pearl Harbor not as a starting point of what happened to the persons of Japanese ancestry with the incarceration, but perhaps an exclamation point on decades of prejudicial context before the war. So I think it's partly for us to address that narrative that was that needs larger explanation.
Right. Yeah, and I think, George, you said the organic racism, you referred to the organic racism. And, I'm curious about the organic nature of that racism, and also that Pearl Harbor exposed the fragility of democracy. So I think about December 6th, of course, I think about all the days leading up to that, and that the narrative of incarceration generally begins with Pearl Harbor. But as we've seen, I think in the past year, especially in the past 2 years, with the surge of violence against Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, as well as the increased awareness of that violence, that what we're learning is that this organic racism goes all the way back to the beginnings of Asians on this continent. And I'm interested in the ways that both of your books address that, Susan in particular, starting with Pearl Harbor, but then beginning to kind of rewind and unravel the reality of this history. So I'm curious, thinking about your books, the ways that you entered into that, how you began to compile the research and think through, and also maybe even feel through the narratives that you were beginning to compose, how that came to be.
Racism against Asians happened from the very beginning when Asians started coming to the United States. The Chinese started coming in the 1840s. They were part of the 49ers seeking gold. And they were all denied simply because of their Asian background. So the racism was from the outset. And many, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act put a stop to the Chinese coming, and the Japanese were sent over as contract laborers. But many of them were farmers, and my grandfather came to California and was farming in the Sacramento Delta. But the land that he developed as a farmer was the land that he could not own by virtue of not being a citizen. Mm-hmm. That was denied him. And in 1912, I think, California passed the Alien Land Law, which said nothing about Asians, but the phrase was aliens ineligible to citizenship, which meant Chinese and Japanese. They were the only ones denied naturalization. And so because my grandfather was not eligible for citizenship, he couldn't buy the land that he developed, which was a wasteland, and he's the one that made it into a productive farmland. So racism against Asians started from the very beginning. And in my hometown of Los Angeles, in 1881, Chinatown was right near the Central Plaza. And a white woman claimed that she was assaulted by a Chinese man. And very quickly, a vigilante group formed. They poured into Chinatown and dragged out 18 Chinese men and young men, and they were strung up on the oak tree in the Central Plaza. So what we know of lynchings in the American South also existed in California as early as 1981 or 1881. And so I say organic racism because discrimination against Asians happened from the moment they stepped onto American soil.
Yes, Susan.
Sure. I think since we've got the community of writers participating, I thought I'd mention that in conceptualizing the arc of the book, that I thought of it as a movie with the scenes unfolding. And so people do identify with Pearl Harbor as being the start of the story, but I wanted to bring that into the lives of the Japanese Americans, the Issei and the Nisei, that were, especially here on the mainland, just quietly going about their Sunday morning activities and coming home from church, or riding a bike in the street, or working in the produce mart and in Los Angeles, and then pulling in that history by essentially flashbacks. But then having the experiences of those who were incarcerated be the voices that propel the historical narrative through the rest of the book.
And that's the thing that I find so wonderful about your book, the personal experiences, the quotes that you have from people who wrote about their experience or spoke about their experience. That roots it in emotion and how they felt. When I started doing research on the internment history, I read Michi Wegland's Years of Infamy, which you write about in your book as well. Her book was encyclopedic, and with dates and places and names of both the villains and the heroes, but very little of that emotion. It was primarily Michi's emotions. But what you encompass is the communal and the diversity of the reaction that people personally had, and that rooting in the people's emotions and feelings is what I think that makes your book so rich and dimensioned.
Oh, thank you. So what I like to do a shout out to are the organizations that really did the work 20, 30, 40 years ago to capture oral histories. Densho, the Japanese American National Museum, many of the Nisei veterans organizations that did the interviews, captured the testimonies, so that we have those records at a time when they were able to tell the story with vibrancy and detail. And the commission hearings that, George, you were one of the
Yes, thank you very much for quoting me.
And so we have great material from firsthand accounts. The testimonies that were written and submitted, and the oral statements that were given and transcribed. But what I realized when I was assembling the materials to teach and now continue to offer the course here at USC, is that there's so much great scholarship that has been done and so many great resources, but it's all spread out, and that there's books that specialize on particular slices of the incarceration experience. For instance, the military heroism, the 442nd and the 100th, or the redress campaign, or the immigration experience. But I thought for teachers and for students and for the general public to have something that really pulls all that material together and makes accessible these stories and makes real the experience, makes undeniable the experience.
Susan, I got to say, however, I noticed a gap in your book. To me, the Tule Lake story is so symbolically powerful of the failure of our democracy, the complete breakdown of the ideals. You talk about the loyalty questionnaires and how completely illiterate they were, and led to confusion and a lot of anger and chaos within the Japanese American community. But then the no-nos were sent to a segregation camp, one camp, Tule Lake, being designated that. Mm-hmm. It was a bristling with militarism camp, 3 layers of barbed wire fences. Each of the sentry towers were installed with machine guns pointed down at the people, and half a dozen tanks patrolling the perimeter. And these are people that were angry to begin with. And many of the young men were radicalized, and they started agitating. Their attitude was, you call us enemy, and by gum, we'll show you what kind of enemy you have to contend with. And they started, I remember waking up in the morning to the cadence of these young men jogging around the block. And they used the Japanese cadence, washoi, washoi, washoi. And I still hear that cadence as they jog. And they wore a hachimaki headband with the military rising sun, with the rays radiating out, painted on their hachimaki headbands. And they would end their jogs with banzai, banzai, banzai. It is a powerful section. And Congress passed the Denaturalization Act in 1944, I think. The House passed it in June and July. Passed it in June, and the Senate in July. And to denaturalize, in other words, to renounce one's citizenship in the middle of a war is an egregiously irresponsible, in fact, a cruel act by the Congress. And that's missing. It's really one of the most important sections of the internment. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to leave that out?
Well, the renunciance is in the book, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a very important.
But you just mentioned renunciance, the power and the grotesqueness of that military authoritarianism should be gone into, because that epitomizes the whole craziness, the insanity of internment. And these are innocent people who had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. And they get rounded up, and the government created these radicals with their relentless, unending outrages and insults and degradation. So I think that deserved at least a chapter, if not more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I don't disagree. It was just trying to have a function of keeping a very complicated part of the story straight for. The book is for the young adult imprint, and trying to just keep the story readable and accessible, and so it's.
Well, mine is a graphic memoir aimed at teenagers, and I dealt with it because it is so, I consider it probably the most important part where the outrage of internment comes to a peak, is the peak of the cruelty. And, you know, that loyalty questionnaire was put together in the chaos and confusion of wartime. A lot of incompetence got into the bureaucracy. And these practically illiterate incompetents were the ones that put together the loyalty questionnaire. And that's all out. I mean, the loyalty questionnaire is in your book, but what that resulted in, the creation of radicals created not by organically out of the community, but the government's stupidity and relentless outrages is what created them. I think there's a sequel book for you to work on.
Well, point well taken.
It makes me think, actually, it was referenced earlier tonight that one of the reasons why we write is to not only redress some of historical ignorance or lack of awareness, and to contribute to the narrative, to contribute to the story, but really to try to illuminate things that aspects of history in the United States that are often not overlooked, but specifically erased from the historical record. And I'm wondering, thinking about, George, what you're saying about Tule Lake and that particular critical part of this story, if there's other pieces of incarceration history that you feel like are not being understood, that are not being talked about, that would serve to further illuminate exactly what this history was all about.
Both Susan's book and my book talks about the internment and the failure or the fallibility of our people's democracy. It's dependent on people, but the viciousness in the human animal can come out. So the government suppressed information during the Supreme Court hearings. I mean, that kind of governmental activity, suppressing vital information, is a real threat and a danger to our democracy. And so that becomes, I think, probably the most important chapter of the internment. And then the redress effort, which is the cleansing and the morality. But you have to have both the worst in order to get to the redemption. Yes. Because if you don't understand how far this madness can go, then the redemption loses its power as well.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the things that, Susan, you pointed out to me is that, of course, there was redress, there was the Civil Liberties Act, there was reparations, there was an apology, but that no individuals were ever held accountable. And your book does an extraordinary job of actually naming all of the individuals who coordinated this historical crisis. Can you say anything more about that idea of what Civil Liberties Act provided, and also the fact that nobody was held accountable, no specific individuals?
Well, it's I think the concept of the Nuremberg trials, that decision makers would be held accountable, would be identified and held accountable. And I don't know that we know all the decision makers. There's this rogues gallery, a great tribute to the scholarship of people like Peter Irons that have delved through the records and sorted out the roles that the various Justice Department and military leaders, the DeWitts and the Bendetsons of the crew, and individuals like John McCloy. But there are undoubtedly others as well. And even the opinion by Justice Douglas in the ex parte endo case that said, after all that had been determined in the Yasui Hirabayashi and Korematsu case, and you have almost as this Supreme Court postscript that yes, they cannot be continued to be held in detention, and they need to be released, but attributes it to an amorphous decision-making process with the War Relocation Authority, right? And so the concept of redress, I think, in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was itself an accomplishment that there was a recognition that it was government wrongdoing, and there were compromises or political compromises in terms of the beneficiaries of that, and having it be prescribed enough that it would be it would have the votes in order to pass, but so many were left out. The Japanese American, the Japanese Latin Americans, the descendants of incarcerees who had already passed away as of the date of the passage of the bill, and the effectiveness of the funding, the fact that it was a short term, that there was a sunset to the program, and in particular to the educational program. So there's conversation today with the descendants of enslaved persons in the Black American community as to how much of the redress effort in the Japanese American community is a model for reparations, and there's still a lot to talk about there, but I think for those that were part of the redress program, redress payment, that it was a recognition of in symbolic and token ways that it was wrongful action by the government.
I agree that it's important to talk about the individual heroes, and mine is Wayne Collins.
Yes,
he was an unusual, and he was also Michi Wegland's a hero. She dedicates her book to Wayne Collins. He was this passionate Irish-American lawyer with the ACLU. Incidentally, the only chapter was the San Francisco chapter. The other chapters in the United States did not take a position because the national board of the ACLU was filled with Roosevelt people. But Wayne Collins was the one that took the most challenging Japanese American cases that wouldn't be touched by any lawyer with a 10-foot pole. He took on of the renunciants, Tokyo Rose, Iva Toguri the Kino. He was an amazing fighter for the ideals of American democracy, and he was a passionate lover of the Constitution. I think Senator Danny Noe is another hero and a wise man, particularly during redress, where he disappointed the JACL advocates by urging that first a commission be organized to gather information. Essentially, this was his way of educating his compatriots in the Senate and also the House on the issues involved there. And the advocate for redress would come from that body rather than Japanese Americans. JACL was a little reluctant to go with that idea, but in the long run, it showed that Senator Inoue was the wise man that made redress possible. And that's where you found my testimony and quoted.
Yes, well, Senator Inoue was so astute. I mean, he also recommended that the commission be blue ribbon and be composed of individuals that had a very diverse background, but was very highly respected in each of their careers, and that there was only one a Japanese American, Bill Maritani, as a result, and that he took on the battle for the entitlements, for the payments.
I have an almost embarrassing number of questions to ask, but I do want to bring it back to the book, both of your books, thinking about there are maybe obvious reasons why you would orient these books towards younger readers, but I'm wondering what that meant or means to you, why you made that decision to write these books with younger readers in mind.
When I was a teenager, I loved comic books. And you, at that age, you're absorbing in information through your pores. I was lucky in having the father that I had. He was an extraordinary man, because most Japanese American parents of my parents' generation did not talk about their internment experience with their children. And there are so many young people, young Japanese Americans today. And from my vantage point, anyone under 60 is young. But they, for example, when we were doing Allegiance on Broadway, many Japanese Americans came backstage to tell me how moved they were by the drama, and tell me that their parents and grandparents were in camp. And so I would respond to them by saying, "Oh, which camp were they in?" Their faces a complete blank.
Oh, really? Oh.
So many of those, I really was shocked. And to help them out, I would say, well, was it Wyoming, Idaho, Arizona? They don't know. So many Japanese Americans don't know. Our mission is to raise the awareness of Americans generally on the internment story. But Japanese Americans, younger Japanese Americans, don't know their own personal family histories. And that's why I decided to reach young people, Japanese Americans, as well as all young people. And the best way to reach them is through my teenage love, the comic book. The more fancy name or word is graphic memoir, but I still call it a comic book.
Susan, how about you? Same question.
Well, I think one of the first comments that I got with the launch event with Romans in the chat was from a reader who is Sansei, so my generation, and said that after going through my book, that she had a way to talk about her family story with her grandchildren. So now we're talking about her children being Yonsei generation, the fourth generation, and her grandchildren being the Gosei generation. And so she said that she just, because of that silence that George mentioned, that she didn't know enough information to be able to conceptualize the story and to have a way to hang her own family history into place. And so I was very happy to hear that with that comment, because and it's not about just young readers, but it's about how any reader could relate to the impact and the story. In my USC course, I have really very few students who are Japanese American of any identity, and really only two in all the students that have had some ancestor be an incarceree. So the students are really from all different kinds of family history and racial and ethnic identities. and what I'm pleased about as we go through this analysis of what the incarceration means and what it means today, that they're motivated to look into their own family histories and to be motivated to want to learn more about why their families came to the United States and what's been their story. In some cases, their first generation or second generation. So in other cases, their families have been here for many generations. And so I think it's a way to reference our personal histories.
So I think that in a few minutes, we're going to open up to questions from the crowd. Before we do that, I'm wondering if you would both be interested in reading something short from each of your books, Susan and then George, and then we'll see what people have to ask.
One of the delights in going through the materials was to come across poetry by especially the Nisei that were students, high school students in camp. And it shows up in the camp newsletters. And then there's a couple of great poets of renown in the community, Mitsuya and Yamada and Toyo Tsunemoto. And so one of the poems that I included in the book is by Mitsuya Yamada when she was 19 and in Puyallup Assembly Center and then in Minidoka. And it's about the experience of them being evacuated. And the title of the poem is Evacuation. As we boarded the bus, bags on both sides, I had never packed 2 bags before on a vacation lasting forever. The Seattle Times photographer said, "Smile." So I obediently smiled. And the caption the next day read, "No, smiling faces, a lesson to Tokyo."
Mine is, as I said, a comic book. So the narrative accompanies these panels, the pictures. And so this is one where we're on a train. We've been in Santa Anita, and we're headed to the farthest eastern of the camps, Rower in Arkansas, southeastern Arkansas. And this describes part of that trip. Oh, and I have a brother a year younger than me, Henry, 4 years old. And my baby sister wasn't quite a year old yet. She was a baby. And my mother and father, and we sat for 4 days and 3 nights on hard wooden seats. Mama offered each of us our very own canteen of water. At the time, I thought nothing of it, as I enjoyed sips of lukewarm water we were periodically treated to. In actuality, my mother, with her obsessive concern over our well-being, had brought them because she was worried about the quality of the water supply on the trip. Boredom was another foe Mama was determined to fight. I have glowing recollections of her wonderful bag of goodies that made the trip absolutely unforgettable. She had stuffed her limited luggage space with special treats for us. This made for 2 starkly different journeys. One, mine, an adventure of discovery. The other, an anxiety-ridden voyage into a fearful unknown. Mama kept herself preoccupied all the time, unwilling to surrender to the anguish of what she was unable to control. Cleaning up after Henry, who got motion sickness, or waiting with me in line for the bathroom. Mama was not going to allow anything, not even the United States government, to affect her family's well-being. I remember her obsessive concern and my father's melancholy. But they are dusty peripheral remembrances. My bright, sharp memories are of a joyful time of games, play, and discoveries. Memory is a wily keeper of the past, usually dependable, but at times deceptive. Childhood memories are especially slippery, sweet, and so full of joy. They can often be a misrendering of the truth. For a child, that sweetness, out of context and intensely subjective, remain forever real. I know that I always will be haunted by the larger, vaguely remembered reality of the circumstances surrounding my childhood.
That is an incredible section of your book. I'm really glad that you read that part. Thank you both. I'm going to open it up to some questions from the audience. And there are quite a few, so I'm going to try to consolidate some of these questions. So this is a question for Susan, and then there's a separate section for George, both addressing research, the subject of researching for your book. To George, the question is, how did research play a role in your writing process? And did any of your memories not match the facts of your research, which I think the section you just read speaks to that. And then for Susan, what was the most interesting topic to research as you compiled information for your book? So questions about research for both of you.
Well, my first research source was my father. As I said, my father shared with me when I became a teenager and started asking questions. And he shared some very anguishing times that he went through. And I was one of these pushy, idealistic kid. And sometimes the conversation got very heated. And I remember one conversation that still haunts me to this day, where I said, "Daddy, why did you go? It was wrong. You should have spoken up, stood up." And he said, "I had to think about you, your mother, your brother, and your sister. They were pointing guns with bayonets at me. What do you think you would have done?" And I understood that. But he said, you'll understand when you get older. And he said, when I'm a grown-up, and I got a little angry, and I said, "Daddy, you led us like sheep to slaughter into the internment camps." And suddenly, the conversation stopped. He was silent. And I immediately knew I had touched a nerve. This young, arrogant young kid, me, knowing all the anguish that he went through, hurt him again. And after a lot of beats that seemed like an eternity, he looked up at me and said, "Well, maybe you're right." And he walked into his bedroom and closed the door. And I felt terrible. I wanted to go to his door and knock on it and apologize, but I thought, well, I'll apologize tomorrow in the morning. And I didn't apologize. And then the next morning, it was even more awkward. And the next morning, and the more mornings that pass, it gets even more awkward. And I never apologized. And now I can't apologize. But he was my first source, and I'm grateful that he was so sharing of that. And he was also trying to guide me. He said, "Ours is a participatory democracy. You've got to participate, be active in student government, volunteer for things." And I was elected student body president at Mount Vernon Junior High and senior board president at Los Angeles High School. And it was during that time, no, it was even later, I think, that I discovered Michi Wegman's years of infamy. And so my father and Michi Wegland were my two major research sources.
Trying to identify the most interesting topic would be like choosing a favorite child. I fortunately only have one child, so she gets to be my favorite. But I'd say that I was just always continually shocked and touched by the stories that I would come across from my work in the redress campaign. I heard so much, and so I considered myself to be familiar with generally what the stories were, but I was just always proved to be in an area where there's just no end to the examples of hardship, of tragedy, of loss, but also of bravery, of resilience, of deep commitment within families and to the community. I did take advantage of the opportunity when I had a conference in Washington, D.C. to make the arrangements to go to the National Archives and look up the War Relocation Authority files on my parents, their immediate families, and as many of the collateral relatives as I had time for. And that was one of the most amazing experiences of my life, because again, even though I thought I knew information about their stories, their past, it was just really shocking to see the kind of records that the government kept, to see their handwriting and the correspondence that went on about them in terms of what they went through in trying to get out of camp and trying to relocate back to, come back to, especially on my dad's side, because he had a big family, to keep everyone together and come back to Orange County and try to rebuild their lives, resume farming. And I kept telling myself I had a limited amount of time and just focus and keep taking the pictures and keep taking the notes and process the emotion later, because I was just so angry at what I was reading, and really have come away with just such appreciation and admiration for my Issei grandparents, for my Nisei parents and my dad's siblings, for what they endured and what they went on to do with the rest of their lives, despite what they experienced during the war. And I think that the ability to fold in what I was learning about my own family with what was going on in the larger community in these stories, and what I say with the almost 130 different voices in the book and the biographies that accompany it, that if we think of approximately 120,000 individuals being part of the detention, that there's 120,000 different stories. And if this is just an example to show that there was diversity of feelings and different situations, and how people had to reconcile what they were going to do, both in camp and afterwards, was I think probably the most important part of the effort for me.
Thank you both. I do want to be mindful of the time. I think it's 8 p.m. in New York City. Other people have asked questions. How are you both feeling about answering questions? Or
I'm fine.
Okay.
Sure, I can be happy to continue.
So I'm going to consolidate a couple more questions. And I think that maybe this is somewhat in response to both of the answers that you provided, and thinking about the emotional inheritance and the freshness of the emotions. George, you talking about your conversations with your father, and Susan, you're talking about your anger. And even for myself, reading both of your books, by the time I reached the end of both of them, I cried at the end of both of them. George, when you arrive at Rower and you're standing there in front of the obelisk, and Susan, when you write about the protests at Fort Sill, and the testimony by Satsuki Ina. And, civil liberties act was 33 years ago. I'm Yonsei. It's been 2 generations since my grandfather's experience during the war, but I still feel emotions. I still feel anger, and I'm curious about that. How it still remains fresh and still remains unresolved. So from that thought to this question that is being posed, so this is a question from a woman named Alyssa. As a granddaughter of Tule Lake prisoners and a PhD student studying World War II Japanese incarceration at the University of Hawaii, I sometimes feel emotionally burned out with my research since it's so personal. Have you ever felt this way with your research or with revisiting your memories? If so, do you have any tips on how to get back on track to do the important work and to tell the stories that need to be heard?
Whenever I share my childhood incarceration with non-Japanese people that I consider well-informed, well-read people, and they're shocked that such a thing happened in the United States, I'm shocked, because this should be something that Americans should know about. It's our Constitution, a system of justice, equal justice under the law that was violated. And I come across that shock so often that's what energizes me. I've got to, my mission is to help raise the awareness. And that's why I'm so grateful to you, Susan, for your contribution with that epic work that you did. I mean, just carrying it around, my arm gets tired.
I've gotten a fair amount of grief about the weight of the book. Yeah. Well, no,
I'm a lot of paper there.
I'm totally with George that I knew when the book was, thinking about the actual release of the book, it's going to go out there into the public now. And for my redress work, I knew that there are those that continue to think that, well, no, it was justified. And, oh, you have to understand what we were dealing with. And I had an op-ed come out in the LA Times on Sunday. And sure enough, the very first email that I received was someone who said, you have to understand, you can't understand what it was like. Maybe it was racial discrimination, but it was justified, and war is hell. So now I'm quoting, war is hell. Everyone suffered, let it lie and move on. Mm. So this is what motivates me.
Let it lie and move on.
Yeah. No, we're not going to move on.
We're going to move forward. We're going to educate Americans about America and how important participation, good people who know what our justice system is, to actively participate. I mean, we have such a divided electorate now. I mean, now it's not just crazy Republicans and passionate Democrats, but it's crazy people against crazy people on the Republican side now. I mean, it's so fractured. And at a time like this, all we need is one explosive event, and it can happen again all over. We've got to get people educated to what America, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That's got to be what unites us.
Here.
Another of the many powerful things about both of your books, as I mentioned, is how they end. And George, you reference Trump versus Hawaii. In a way, your graphic memoir ends with that before your return to Rower. And then Susan, a description of protests at migrant detention facilities. And so maybe bringing it back to this anniversary, December 7th, 1941, thinking about these enormous holes in collective understanding of US history, and how the ways that we understand Japanese American in history can help us stand in solidarity with other communities that are being targeted, which I found your books are do that beautifully, I think, in sort of like having that be the way into the future. What are some of the issues that the two of you are thinking about now as you're doing this work, as you're giving talks and interviews and telling the story of your own experience? What are some things that you're paying attention to right now in this country?
I try to relate the internment experience to the issues of our time today. You mentioned the Muslim travel ban, mm-hmm. and I see that despite the ugliness of the thinking behind it, I see that as hopeful because when we were incarcerated, we didn't have friends other than Mormons and Quakers that came to our aid. But when Trump tried with his first executive order to ban Muslims coming into the country, thousands of young Americans rushed to their airports throughout the country to welcome Muslim people coming in, many of them lawyers to give legal assistance. And Sally Yates, the Deputy Attorney General, said to Trump, "I will not defend this executive order." That gives me hope. People are becoming aware of the failure after December 7th and February 19th. And there are people that are benefiting from that lesson that to be learned. So as horrible as that Muslim travel ban was, I saw a reason for optimism as well.
So I'm looking ahead to teaching again in January, and now with students who have for a year and a half been living with, as all of us in society, living with the ramifications of COVID protocols of the pandemic, and so it's I'm going to do a session on what I'll call the government toolkits for what's in the government arsenal when there's considerations of, okay, taking away some personal liberties, but in the objective of national good. Now with COVID protocols, it's with the ideas that there's we need to do this for public health, right? So it's now we're carrying or need to show proof of vaccination, okay, or there were at times curfews in terms of, how late people could stay out, so people weren't congregating in late night clubs and restaurants and bars, right? So there's we had travel restrictions at various points in terms of if you go farther than 100 miles or 300 miles, there are different kind of quarantines or, testing that you had to do. So these were in various ways, these are what happened to Japanese Americans in terms of curfew, travel restrictions, alien registry. Many of these were replicated with what happened after 9/11 and the cases that ended up with the Trump travel ban, with Trump versus Hawaii. So these are the trade-offs between whether it's national security or public health and personal civil liberties. And so as a society, there's going to be this tension, and where do you and how do you choose what are the appropriate ways for a government to justify these kinds of actions. And so I think it is what failed in the Korematsu case, what failed again with the Trump versus Hawaii case was the Supreme Court, the legal system supporting the executive branch and not having to produce data and to justify the decisions. It was, well, you're the experts, and so we defer to the executive branch. And so these are the kinds of ramifications that I think, whatever the issue, really strike at the heart of our constitutional system. And so that no matter what anyone's where they come down politically or what their personal philosophies might be, that as Americans, to go back to George's point, as Americans, we should all care that our government operates in constitutionally accountable ways.
I'll throw in one final question, and maybe it's sort of a general one. And in fact, I think you've maybe already answered it, both of you. Amber is wondering, what are some ways that people can spread more awareness of this topic? And then she attaches to that question, what age do you think talking about this with children is appropriate? Thinking about how both of your books are oriented towards younger readers. I have an answer to that, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about either of those things. How can we continue to spread this, which is exactly what you're both doing? And then when can we begin to talk to younger folks about our history?
Buy our books. That'll, but also I'm working on a children's picture book. We want to get people very young. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, daddy and mama reading to their kids about this in the language that they can handle. They call us enemy. I'm reaching for the teen crowd, teen readership. But now I'm going for a little bit younger, and it includes the parents and the children.
Mm-hmm. I think there's...
And buy Susan's book. That gives you a lot of research that you can avoid, because you'll find the material right there.
Well, I think no matter what the age of our children, and even for ourselves, I think of the line from South Pacific, they have to be carefully taught, right? That if we are able to be positive influences on the young people in our lives, that to look beyond appearances, to look at, to get to know individuals by who they are, by their heart, and not be that we and others, we're not being judged by how we look, or what perceptions are being drawn because of what are perceived racial differences. Then I think that would be an important positive thing. However we talk about it, and however we encourage that.
I want to thank you both. I mean it sincerely when I said that I wish I had books like these when I was growing up, and possibly books like these might have existed in some form, but they didn't exist on the shelves of the house where I grew up. It would have saved me, as I said, decades of asking questions that I think I'm still asking. So in a way, even having the knowledge and immersing oneself in this history, it doesn't necessarily resolve the confusion and the anger and the trauma that continues to proliferate. I should also say, by the way, for people who are interested in buying these books, and people should, is that they're wonderful books to read together. They complement each other in really interesting ways. And that was one of the enjoyable things for me about reading both of them. So I thank you both so much, and for sharing your experiences and answering questions and having me along with you. Thank you both.
It's been our pleasure.
My honor.
And on that note, I'd like to echo Brandon's thanks. It was, excuse me, it was such a pleasure to listen to this conversation. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, George. It was incredibly enlightening. And thank you, Brandon, for just shepherding such a wonderful, beautiful discussion. I'm truly appreciative of all of you. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Asian American Writers Workshop. If you'd like to see more of their work and their programming, you can follow them at www.aaww.org. I've dropped links to purchase all of the books in, and so I'm just gonna quickly wave them in front of you in case there's a visual reminder is useful. And then also including Brandon's book, The Grave on the Wall. And on that note, thank you everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabir.